What this is leading me on to now is the notion of diagonals. Yeah, so last week I was talking about the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds basically being the idea that you create this grid, like a kind of noughts and crosses or tic-tac-toe grid, and where the kind of inner square, the corners of the inner square, become the important bits in the photo. However, whilst it's been adopted very strongly as a major piece of photographic composition, pretty much everybody who's been doing photography for any length of time sooner or later stumbles across this rule of thirds, and it shifts their photography up a level, because rather than putting everything in the middle, they put things off center, and suddenly things seem to have a bit more edge to them. The problem with it is it encourages block thinking. Because you've got 3 rows that are divided up into little squares or little rectangles, it makes you think in terms of horizontals and verticals. And that's fine, that's relatively stable. But diagonals are really where the action is. And a lot of people, they think they hear a rule of thirds and they think, oh, I understand rule of thirds. I now know everything there is to know about photography because I know the rule. As I said last week, it's not really a rule, it's more of a guideline. But I think equally important, if not more important in a lot of ways, is truly understanding the notion of diagonals and how much more energy they give to a photo. If this photo had everybody just going straight back in a line, it would be a different kind of photo. But that really strong diagonal that's just shooting across the screen, it creates a sense of movement. Even though we know everybody is sitting there, perfectly static, it creates a sense of movement, of drive, of energy. It also creates a great sense of depth, which when things are flat on, when things are just doing with the horizontal and the vertical, you don't necessarily have that sense of depth. You get the depth with the kind of perspective lines as they sort of narrow down into the picture. What I want to do now, I'll give you a couple of other examples of where this works. So, yeah, I'm going to have a bit of fun, I think. In a past life, we're talking, 8-9 years ago, I can't remember exactly. I used to belong to a band called Scruffy Buzzards. And we decided we needed a photo for our EP cover that was coming out. And so we did a photo shoot, and this photo was never used. This is just one from the shoot. And essentially it's a kind of standard indie band type photo, 4 blokes in front of a garage door. And like I say, this one's unedited. I would have then cropped it in, I would have added bits of texture and all what have you. Now, the main thing about this is, whilst there are a couple of diagonals in it, you can see this is a bouzouki, by the way, which is kind of like a large mandolin in a lot of ways. But there's a diagonal going up here, and there's a sort of slight diagonal here, a little bit there, but mostly the powerful lines here are vertical. It's up and down. And yeah, it's got 4 blokes in front of a garage door with varying degrees of how moody we were able to look for that particular shot. But we didn't end up doing this. I became aware very quickly that it wasn't really doing what we wanted to do. So we'd got this other idea of creating a more dynamic kind of photo where we were going to maybe beat each other up with the instruments. So with that, yes, this is the edited version, the final one that ended up on the cover, and it's a lot of fun, there's a lot of energy in it. I mean, yes, we're all standing posing, but everybody's got a certain tension in the way they're holding the instruments, all pulling our faces kind of thing. But what allows, what ramps that up to the nth degree is all these really, really, really strong diagonal lines. There's very little in the way of anything that really is. I mean, there's a couple of, vertical lines, but mostly wherever possible, we've sort of bent the legs, we've turned the arms, we've got all the instruments sitting at angles. And then what I've done is I've created an overlay, a textured overlay. You can see it kind of gets all rough and grungy around the side. But that grunge itself has got diagonal lines built into it as well. So there's a huge amount of power and energy goes into that. And it was a lot of fun, and it got used widely. It was a fun photo to have. Another example, very gentle example. Maybe let's say we take the notion of a tulip. Even with something as soft and gentle and peaceful and tranquil as a flower photo, if you imagine that flower straight up on a strong vertical, it's fine, but it's a softer photo. When it's leaning over, there's that little bit more energy in it. There's that little bit more movement in it. There's a notion of tension. There's an idea with photography, sort of dynamic tension. The reason rule of thirds works better than just having something sitting in the middle is because our brains are geared to what doesn't quite look right. If something looks perfectly safe and stable, our brains will tend to ignore it. But if something's slightly out of kilter, we're primed to notice. Now, instead of something being center, something is off center, you notice it a little bit more. And so if you're noticing it, your attention is on it a little bit longer, which in this day and age, particularly when everybody sort of, we shoot through the photos we see online, we go through our feeds at high speed, trying to grab anybody's attention can be quite difficult. But once you start, now a diagonal is inherently more tense than a vertical or a horizontal. If you had a tree or a pole, if a pole was sort of sitting straight up, it's stable. If it's lying down, it's stable. But if it's at an angle, it feels like it's in movement. It feels like it could just about be falling over. Maybe you've captured it as it's falling, or maybe it could fall at any moment. That tension adds energy to the photo. It adds a level of interest and capture. Let's show another another example. Would be, now I was doing a shoot at a factory where they're welding up the chains for trawlers that go out at sea and trawl up the seabeds. Now, this photo was never used. This was just one of those that I was taking while I was sort of getting a hang of what the light was doing and where we were. And again, what you can see here is strong verticals, strong horizontals. So what I then did was I moved around and I put the wide angle lens on the camera, and we now end up with this. And now, whilst there's a strong horizontal there, that's pretty much the horizontal there. Even the verticals are slightly off that kind of, because of the wide distortion of the wide angle lens. This is coming down an angle. He's standing at an angle. The angles of the table, none of them are, because of that distortion, none of them are sitting at 90 degrees. And the extra level of energy and tension that's put into it is quite remarkable when you consider, like I said, now this one's edited, this one is not. But regardless of the editing, there's a limit to what I could do with this, whereas this one does have much more of a kind of a feel to it. Another example, even something like this wonderful old bridge over the River Dee and just south of Clattering Shores Loch. So the fact that it runs down this diagonal here and then the reflection creates a diagonal here, I could have taken it straight on and had even arches. Well, I might have been able to, but I'd have probably been knee deep in water. But that aside, the diagonals it gives you a depth that's going across the screen, as well as seeing the depth that's going through, seeing the road bridge behind it and through to the river further down. But these lines through are giving it more energy. And where it really comes into play, to show you a difference, I did a set of photos with Fitch and McAndrew, a couple of potters based up in Corsica in the Galloway Hills. And let me show you this photo. Now this photo is of Hannah while she's applying relief onto the clay. And it's very much about the verticals and the horizontals. And we wanted this because it's a soft, gentle process. When you watch her, she's very concentrated. It's almost zen really in that moment of painting the relief onto the plate. And so we didn't want a hard energy with that. However, her husband Doug, when we were doing him, I was shooting him building a pot. And here now, with that elbow going up, with his hand going into the pot, you've got this incredibly strong diagonal line. He's tilted over and the whole energy is really built into it. This horizontal line here is completely, and the little verticals behind are completely outweighed by the power of that diagonal. Another one here where, again, if we'd had him just sort of straight on, it would have been a much quieter shot. But with the tilt of the head, with the arm coming up, with this arm coming down, you get the water coming off the sponge. But it's not just the water coming off the sponge. He could have been straight up with squeezing the water out. It's that center, the diagonals are where the energy and the movement is. So that's really what I wanted to talk about. I want you to, when you next get out the camera, find whatever you're taking a photo of, but start thinking about how you can introduce more tension into it. How you can introduce, not just going off center, but look at the diagonals. Where are the diagonals happening? Can you introduce them into the picture by changing your camera angle? And play, see what happens with that. And I think once you start to really play with it, it sort of becomes slightly addictive and it's fun, and it gives you something else to play with. It's another tool in your tool bag for developing the photos. So there we go. That's what I wanted to say about diagonals. If you found this useful, let your friends know and hit subscribe.